you all for coming here. It's great to see you all. I want to thank Wade. And before I actually introduce Professor Visker, I want to take a moment to acknowledge all those who made this lecture possible, especially on relatively short notice. First and foremost, our provost, Dr. Kyle Fedler, was very flexible and helpful in putting this together. Our Dean of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Jim Bird, and of course, Dr. Wade Willis, the chair of our Department of Religion and Philosophy. I mean, sincerely, you can't imagine, without their generosity, flexibility, and patience, we just would not have events like this going on, which are, of course, wonderful both for us, but also for our speakers who get to enjoy our beautiful campus and neat Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. So let's take a moment to thank everybody involved who pulled this together. So, a few words about Professor Rudi Visker. Rudi Visker is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Center for Phenomenology and Continental Philosophy in association with the Husserl Archives at the Catholic University of Leuven, or Leuven, and I'll be corrected with that, in Belgium. His published works include 5 separate book-length monographs, including The Inhuman Condition, Looking for Difference after Levinas and Heidegger, Truth and Singularity, Taking Foucault to Phenomenology, Michel Foucault, Genealogy as Critique, which was also published in Dutch and in German, Vreemdgaan en Vreemdblijven, Filosofie van de Multiculturaliteit. Is that pretty good? Well, thank you. It's been a while since I've pronounced Dutch.
6.
Okay, 6 out of 20, which is definitely failing. And then Lof der Zichtbaarheid, in leiding in the oh man, in contemporary philosophy. I'm just kidding, translation from Dutch. That word's always got me.
That's a 5.
In addition to this, Professor Visker has published over 50 scholarly articles in 4 different languages, and is also a noted public intellectual who is not infrequently referenced by popular publications, magazines, and newspapers in his native Belgium. By the way, my favorite of which includes this lovely 2-page spread, which I bring mostly to embarrass him. But isn't that magnificent? Look at that. How many famous philosophers do you know get full-page photographic spreads like that? Professor Visker's interests span the breadth and depth of philosophy. He has in turn published on the nature of life and death, and more intriguingly, the question of the possibility of death after life, and not, as we would naturally hear it, life after death. His works have queried the value of art, plumbed the nature, meaning, and value of alienation, and challenged us to think more deeply about the nature of political discourse and personal identity. More recently, Professor Visker has turned to the question of cultural difference in the public sphere, the topic of his lecture tonight. On a more personal note, Professor Visker has been for me a teacher, a mentor, at times an antagonist, always an inspiration, a reluctant surrogate father, and finally a dear friend. And I'm very, very honored, grateful, and pleased to have the opportunity to introduce him to you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me in my turn express my gratitude for being invited here, and I thank to the Provost's office, the Department of Religion and Philosophy, and the Division of Arts and Aesthetics. And I welcome you. The lecture I give tonight, I gave that in Belgium at the lectures as a lecture for the 21st century, which is a lecture series that is organized in Leuven for a very difficult audience. It contains your own colleagues from other faculties, lay people with a university degree or without, and students from all over the university. And it was brought for 1,000 persons, people, okay. Now everything I'm going to say in this paper, or nothing I'm going to say in this paper, is about the USA. It's all about Europe, and more particularly Northern Europe, yeah? And specifically about Belgium. Bear that in mind. Now, when philosophers are invited to shine their light on social problems, their audience, more often than not, expects them to formulate a solution to the problem at hand. I shall refuse to do this for reasons of principle. My conception of philosophy forbids me to do so. It is Socratic. I will try to show you that you have already formulated answers yourselves to the questions you expect me to answer. Your answers come at a price of which you are probably unaware. They are based on implicit presuppositions. I shall try to explicate. In doing so, I will show you that these presuppositions are not simply evident and could equally well be replaced by others. But I won't tell you that these presuppositions are false and that the other ones are more correct. That would go against the ethos that inspires me as a philosopher. I don't want to offer you better answers or better solutions. I only want to offer you more questions. For example, about how you understand the different worlds in my time. Multicultural, different, public sphere, including the preposition in. I want to show you that such understanding does not originate in each of you, but that a certain philosophy lies hidden in it. My aim is to bring that philosophy into the light and to wonder with you how it is that it is this philosophy, rather than another one, that came to master the significance of these words. I divided the paper into a number of sections. I shall, for didactic reasons, read the titles of the sections. The first section is called Our Current Conception of the Public Sphere is More Ambivalent Than It Pretends. Let me start with a simple example from the not-so-distant past. The Danish cartoon riots and the Islamic protests against these cartoons. You remember these cartoons? One of them pictured the Prophet Mohammed with a bomb sticking out of his turban. The Muslim world was shocked. There were violent riots, and the West was reminded of the earlier Rushdie affair and judged that here too what was at stake was a freedom of expression. We did not understand the reaction of the Muslims. We considered it to be exaggerated and inappropriate. It testified to a different conception of the place of religion in the public sphere. For us, religion belongs to the private realm, and any fusion of it with public realm should be avoided. What we did not mention in our reaction, however, was what we meant with these words, public and private. On closer inspection, it appeared that we meant two things, and that these two contradicted each other, without anyone noticing so. There was on the one hand the freedom of expression of opinion, and that freedom was understood as the word indicates. That is, as the freedom to express opinions that you already have. That is, to bring them out into the open, to distribute them, to make them public. Of course, there are, at least in Europe, certain limitations to this. For example, this is a European example. One cannot publicly deny the existence of the Holocaust. I told you can in America. But these limits, one reasoned, were not transgressed in the cartoon example. Furthermore, such limitations should be as minimal as possible. The ideal situation is one in which one can repeat the opinions one already has completely and without any changes in the public realm. The latter is thereby understood as a bigger and more encompassing space than the private one, that thus needs to be, as it were, aggrandized in it. Put differently, ideally one should be able to comport oneself in the public realm in exactly the same way as in the private. If someone, for example, feels privately that all Muslims are, apologize for the expression, goat fuckers, then he has to be able to make this opinion public, and those addressed must tolerate. They should not in any way be shocked. For those who happen to be shocked have not understood what it means to be a citizen of the public sphere. But wait a moment. Did we not contradict ourselves just now? Did we not hold that the private should be restlessly translatable in the public? And were we now not holding the opposite opinion? One could be shocked as long as one keeps that shock indoors and one does not bring it out into the open in the public realm. Not only may one, of course, not translate the shock into violence, but one should also not show oneself to be shocked. If one does that, nonetheless, then one behaves as a knight of morality, who, like Don Quixote, seems lost in an epoch of which he does not grasp the logic. In other words, one has not learned in that case that what one holds privately for holy in the largest possible sense, or not necessarily religious sense, and that what has absolute validity for one in the private sphere loses that status in the public sphere. There it is expected that one has a notion of its relativity, and hence also shows tolerance towards others for whom something else, or even nothing, is holy, and who, if they feel like doing so, should be allowed to ridicule your holy and absolute thing, for example, by publishing cartoons. In this example, in fact, two conceptions of the public sphere collide with each other. But the smack is not heard, because one of these traditions is much stronger than the other. There is on the one hand what I could call, in continental terms and only continental terms, the liberal tradition, that regards the public as an aggrandizement of the private and thinks that what one does in the private sphere, one should also, within certain limits, be able to do in the first. But there is also a different tradition that one finds, that only finds a distorted echo in my example. According to that tradition, the public realm must be something totally different than a mere mirror image of the private. It should display a different logic, for it is a different order, with different rules of ordering, and with a productivity of its own. Rather than to merely reproduce the private, the public here has to do something with it, or to it. It has to impress its own order onto the private. In other words, it has to transform the private sphere. One finds elements of that second tradition in such different authors as Helmut Plessner, Arnold Gehlen, or more to the left, Hannah Arendt, Wiener essay What is Freedom, protested against the, in her terms, liberal and Christian tradition that sees liberty as something that needs to be protected from a political or a public influence. The less politics, she says, the more free to describe that tradition. It's not what she wrote. Freedom is, in other words, for her, the product of public space. It does not precede it, which is why she reacted against that condition. One does not, for example, already have free opinions that one can consequently make public, but one comes to one's own opinion only in interaction with others. Such an interaction presupposes a context that is broader than the private one, in which people can have a conversation with one another about matters that one cannot judge from a private standpoint. For the private standpoint will always be bound to the condition of one's own survival. In the public exchange of opinions, to the contrary, one exchanges opinions about the good of the commonwealth. And that is, one always has to keep an eye to those interests of the good of the commonwealth. And these are interests of something that antedates each of the participants in such a discussion, and that will outlast them all. To serve that public interest, one has to cut the ties with what Arendt calls the life process, by thus situating oneself at a different level than at the private. Only then can one be truly free, she reasons, not enslaved to the interests of the stock. Think, for example, about a public jury whose judgment may not derive from each member's interest to formulate a judgment as soon as possible, so that one can mind one's own private affairs. The one has a date, the other wants to go golfing, a third to see a theatre play. Sidney Lumet's 12 Angry Men, I don't know if you've seen the movie. It's a movie of 1957. Is a perfect illustration of what Arendt has in mind. In that jury, there is but one person who wants to reach a judgment beyond reasonable doubt. And it is he who gradually convinces the other jurors to place themselves at the public level. That is, at the level of laws that not only guarantee freedom, but produce it. And he succeeds in it. I hesitate to give a name to this other tradition. Arendt differs from most Republican thinkers who hold that my freedom is only possible if all are free, and that such presupposes that everyone should be willing to defend the public realm, for example, by not having a hired army, but by taking up one's own military service, as Quentin Skinner nowadays argues for. Arendt goes beyond this and thinks that humans only come to freedom by participating in the public sphere. The latter thus produces a freedom that is not possible without it. The public does something. It liberates you from private unfreedom, from the life process, and brings about truth. This reasoning stands square to the one I have shown to be at work in the cartoon itself. But it received a twisted echo. Whereas the cartoonist was held to have the right to express his private opinion in the public sphere without further ado, those that felt to be shocked in their private opinions were expected to behave differently in the public realm. They should not show their shock. That means differently here means not according to the logic of the private, but taking into consideration the new public element which was involved. Hence one apparently without noticing measures with different ways. On the one hand, one wants to protect the freedom to express one's private opinions. On the other hand, one expects that others should be prepared to publicly bracket the opinions they privately hold and tolerate that others ridicule. what the second section is, mourning and religious civilization. What I wanted to show by way of the preceding example is that the average reaction to the way Muslims reacted to the cartoons of their prophet is far less unambiguous than may have seen at first sight. Our reaction springs in fact from two traditions, whereby one of them rings louder than the other. In the rest of this lecture I shall try to develop a version of the non-literal tradition and show that it has a certain potential to it, to help us relate differently than we do at the moment to multicultural differences. My version, however, does not correspond to the one developed by Arendt, but it does build further on the emphasis she laid on the difference between the logic of the public and that of the private that has to be transformed by the form. To indicate that transformation, I will use a word familiar to all of you, but I'll give a different meaning to it. I'll talk about a symbolization process, a symbolic order, and symbols. Now, by symbolic, I do not understand what you understand. That is very probably something that, for some reason or other, merely comes to replace something else. Yeah? Something to which it refers and something to which it owes its meaning. That is the normal usage of the word. Like, for example, when you speak of a symbolic dollar, the court gives as a compensation to someone rich enough to do without the real amount of compensation. In my own technical usage, the symbolic is, however, not less real than what it symbolizes. It has its own reality, and does not derive that reality from a reality that it would merely repeat, as in the ordinary usage. To the contrary, the symbolic leaves its own imprint on the pre-symbolic, and in so doing forms it or transforms it. I will illustrate what I mean by way of an example that you have perhaps already noticed where I'm heading to. I want to show how the public can do something with the private, and I will specify that something by what the symbolic does with the pre-symbolic. The relation between these two, symbolic and pre-symbolic, is not that of a sign. A sign is not a symbol. A sign has a referential function. For example, a sign of roadworks. They point to the roadworks ahead, and the sign is only legitimate, that is to be observed, if there are roadworks ahead. If on the road you take home daily, there has been this sign since half a year, but no roadworks, then no one, at least in Belgium, respects the speed limit. Yeah? Now, a sign then has a referential function. It points to something else that it does not interfere with. It finds the reason of its existence therein. One can, for example, regard mourning attire as a sign of the grief that someone feels after the death of a friend or a relative. He or she aims at expressing her or his grief by that sign. That is the contemporary way of looking at mourning garb, at least in Europe. Who feels like wearing it can do so. But it's up to him, and it's no one else's business. This way of going through mourning has come to replace an older way. There it was not the individual's business. Whether or not it wanted to give an outward sign of his grief. It was the business of a whole community that determined the mourning ritual up to its finest detail. Who was to wear what and for how long And it forced its members to partake in it, lest they wanted to become excluded. Excluded here was not by putting into prison, but by gossiping about that person who didn't wear the morning attire, or didn't wear it long enough, or wore it too long. In that case, wearing mourning was part of a ritualized symbolic process. Each element of it had a meaning within the public order which fixed that meaning. One was not, for example, free to wear red, green, blue, or yellow, or black. The color for mourning was determined by the community and distinguished from all other colors. He thereby received the meaning that one was in mourning. When one wears black, one is in mourning in most of the older communities. Which is to say that the person on whom mourning was thus imposed entered into an order of symbols, the meaning of which was determined within that order, independently of what he or she felt. Who wore mourning had lost someone, and in wearing mourning, he or she behaved in the appropriate manner. Better still, that meaning held even regardless of whether the person felt grief during the period of mourning. In other words, mourning did not refer to one's grief and did not have to. It did not have to refer to the grief for it to be genuine. It was not a sign of something it had to express. Today it is, with the consequence that who wears mourning should, strictly spoken, either feel grief continuously, for otherwise one gives a false sign and is guilty of a hypocrisy, or should feel guilt continuously, for what one had to feel isn't there all the time, and thus one fails the condition for wearing it. For example, if you go to the baker and with the child accompanying you, and the child, this is a good memory, myself being the child, knocks down a couple of mustard pots. At that moment, the mother is very concerned, and I bet you that at that moment she doesn't feel good. Which means that she gives a false sign and should be either feel guilty or be hypocritical. Today, moreover, the moment to end wearing mourning garment is also a problem. For in that case, one gives the contrary signal that the sign is no longer needed because the grief has passed. Which is a very difficult decision that many hesitate to make. In the other older tradition, the individual did not have to face that decision, for the period of mourning was fixed by the community, and hence laying mourning off did not confront one with the feeling of guilt. Even though one wore mourning, one did not have to give an account for it. The mourning garment, as it were, took over the grief and did what had to be done. There was a period of mourning that is an interruption of the normal course of affairs, and that on a prefixed date could be restarted. These two ways of dealing with mourning are profoundly different. The contemporary one is expressive and sees in mourning a public sign of what one privately feels. The other one is symbolizing. Mourning has a meaning within the symbolic order of the mourning ritual, and that meaning holds independently from what one and even from whether one feels privately. One does not have to feel anything for mourning to mean what it does. Mourning dispenses the person to grieve on his or her emotions and takes them over from him or her. The relevance of this example is clear. One only needs to substitute belief for grief, and the Muslim veil or any other religious symbol for the mourning god. To throw a wholly different light than the current one on recent discussions in Europe about the veil, or more generally about symbols of a certain outlook on life in public functions and in the public realm as such. These symbols ought to be banned. That's a tendency. Why do these discussions always treat religious symbols as signs? As signs of a religious belief one already has. Why does one never ask oneself whether such symbols, analogously to mourning attire, do not rather take the weight of having to continuously feel religiously from the ones who wear them? When one fears, for example, that those who wear a religious symbol will treat their fellow believers differently, that is, less impartially than others, one in fact surmises that the believers have first their religious belief and subsequently wear a sign that refers to their belief, and that can be recognized by others. And the same reasoning is deployed by those who argue against the ban on the veil in the name of the maturity of the Mündigkeit of the Muslimas, who, according to the argument, would know all too well what they are doing, and are not at all repressed or deprived of their maturity by their faith. What one, however, does not demand oneself here is whether that maturity, that Mündigkeit one is appealing to, is truly reconcilable with the idea of a belief of which one, after having it, wears a sign. What if the presupposed sign is, in fact, a symbol that only makes it possible to have this said belief? In order to get a clearer view on these questions, and specifically about the last two, we shall have to briefly turn again to our example of mourning. For I have, in fact, for didactic reasons, slipped a step there that is now time to introduce. It concerns the first phase. Someone dear to you has died, and you remain behind with your grief. But what is the modality of that grief? It seems too simple to refer it, as I have, as simply having grief or feeling grief. Anyone who experienced the death of a dear one knows that this description is incorrect. The grief one feels is too big to have it or to feel it. One drowns in one's grief. One is torn apart and blown away by one's grief. The grief is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Like a pain so severe that you no longer know where it hurts or what hurts. You don't have pain then, you are in pain. And as it were, you dissolve in pain. You can also be in grief in this way. And you are in grief that way when the deceased was dear enough to you. Every distance to such grief falls away. It comes in waves that engulf you, and between you and them, and between them, you are numbed, stunned, and stupefied. You no longer relate to grief; it rather has you than you would have it. The ritual of wearing mourning, its symbolization process, provides you with a distance to have grief in the strict sense. It imposes its own articulation on that unarticulated, amorphous grief. You have to choose the mourning clothes, for example. You have to wash them. You have to put them on and off, etc. All these are concrete actions that tend to domesticate the rawness of your belief into something that you can, to a certain extent, handle. You remain busy, you preserve or you regain a certain initiative that you had lost or were in danger of losing. You are no longer stunned by something that had taken you in and that did not leave you any space. The symbol gives you that space by binding the grief to its materiality. This type of cloth needs to be washed with that kind of soap or whatever. It, as it were, absorbs, the symbol as it were, absorbs the too muchness of grief. It has, in short, a mediating function. Rather than being directly at the mercy of grief, there stands now something between you and it. This piece of cloth, for example, or this rhythm. I have to put it on and on. And only in that way can you begin to feel grief, strictly spoken, rather than being numbed and swept away by it. Grief does not disappear, but rather appears in a new way. The one who feels it is no longer literally crushed. Perhaps you now better, I hope you now better, understand the analogy with religious symbols like the Muslim faith. They too, I suggest, have a mediating function. They hold the divine at a distance. They bind the reference of the divine to certain concrete actions and only thus make it possible to have a religious belief. The ritual and the symbols protect from the divine that without such a mediation would take you in, literally, like a city is taken in. You would not be able to resist its pull. You would be literally enchained by it, put under its spell, be so full of it that you dissolve in it, become part of it, and thus disappear as an individual. The full and direct submission to the divine would annihilate those who are thus exposed to it. The I that feels the divine would qua-I disappear in that feeling. There would only remain an impersonal feeling with no one left to feel it. Of course, this is a limit situation in which ordinary believers do not find themselves because they already partake in an institutionalized religion, in a religious practice that by way of its rules, its rituals and symbols already brings about the distance that I try to make visible. I'm rather thinking of the stories of conversion, Saul on his way to Damascus, of the dangers of the mystical night, where the attraction of the unio mystica must be left behind by the mystic pleasure. And of the older stories like the wife of Zeus, who burned Semele when he showed himself to her in his full glory, at her own request, by the way, a request suggested to her by Zeus' jealous wife, Hera. Good. The third section, the absence of majority and the fundamentalist reaction. Can you follow? Yeah? You all follow. The original relation to the divine is not one in which one can speak for oneself. It rather shuts you up, takes away your majority or Mündigkeit and leaves you without defenses. Majority is often associated with emancipation, a word which literally means the throwing off of a yoke. The mancipio, emancipation has mancipio meaning, is the deed of the manceps, of the one who lays his hand on someone and in so doing enslaves him or her. Since counsel, emancipation is drawing away your hands so as to free your soul. Since Kant's what is enlightenment, emancipation famously came to be the throwing off by oneself of the lack of majority that one owes to oneself. But the third meaning is still possible. One could understand hyphen in emancipation in the line of the foregoing, not as a throwing off or a taking away, but as a point of contact between two poles that have to be disentangled, so that each of the two gets a space to breathe and can thereby stand on its own, become independent in the literal sense of the term. The symbol gives you that space. It does not presuppose majority, but produces it. Each time when a veil is put on or off, there is a concrete materiality over it, on, off, that would not be there without the intervention of the symbol. In other words, perhaps the veil is for those who are wearing it a way not to drown belief, a way to have belief without being or having to be preoccupied by it all the time. If that is the case, and I'm not saying that this is always the case with those who are wearing it, then it could be that we, at least in Europe, misreact in forbidding the veil in order to counter fundamentalism. Yeah. For the effect could be the exactly opposite one. By taking away the mediation of the veil, we might unintentionally hand over those who get freed from the weight of having to be in religion So by taking away this mediation of the veil, I'm a bit tired. By taking away the mediation of the veil, we might unintentionally hand over those who get freed from the weight of having to be in religion. We might hand over these persons to something they do not have the force to resist, because it comes to occupy them fully. In order to not entirely succumb to it, and at least keep a certain stance toward it, they could feel then directly addressed by the force that holds them. They could think of themselves, for example, as having a certain mission or a task, as hearing a message that only they and people like them can hear and understand. So you see that you follow the reasoning? So normally the veil is considered to be a sign of something that is already there, of a belief. And I say, what if the veil is a symbol that allows you to have belief? Similarly, like the morning attire allows you not to drown in grief, but to have grief. If that would be the case, and then you take away the veil, then you confront these persons to an original divine that is going to burn them, or to swallow them up, or to force them to lose their individuality. And that, of course, is something you don't like to happen. And as a last resort, you can then show the fundamentalist reaction that this source which is engulfing you has a message for you. Yeah. You're commissioned, in other words, to become a fundamentalist with a mission. Okay? That's the reason. Yeah. So here we meet with a possible definition of fundamentalism. There is something with a special meaning that can only be grasped by those it detects and makes different from others. That something is not an ordinary something, of course. For the latter has a meaning that is in principle open to all. Here, however, the meaning is preserved for a chosen group, as this is, for example, the case in racism, in sexism, and in certain forms of nationalism. For example, the Vlaams Blok, which is a fascist party in Belgium, and pleading for Flemish independence, has to define Flemish. And they say, is Flemish whoever can sign, mother, father, who were also Flemish. In my case, I would already fail in the first generation because my father was Frisian. Only those who have it, the correct color, the correct sex, or the right origin, can understand the language. They know their own thing that makes them different from others. They would know their own difference. What I am suggesting here is thus that the policy of banning the veil in public functions is based on an implicit hypothesis. This veil is a sign and leads to fundamentalism. A hypothesis that has not been tested and that could equally well be substituted by another hypothesis. It's a symbol and as such wards off fundamentalism. Even if that other hypothesis has not been tested either, I doubt, by the way, whether one can find a crucial test to decide between the two. But the mere possibility of an alternative hypothesis suffices to undo the evidence with which the first presently rules our minds. A self-evident that derives in the last instance from the way that each of us think and talk about all these things, and thus talking and reasoning install ourselves in a public sphere that is but the reflection of our thinking and reasoning. A sphere with signs in it pointing to a different private sphere we aim to aggregize. This is the present conception. Only when we manage to develop a way of reasoning and speaking against our present way, only if we can develop a counter-discourse against it, could the symbolizing conception of the public sphere I have told you about have a chance to materialize itself. To engage in such a counter-discourse, we shall have to dig deeper in my title. What exactly do we understand by differences, multicultural differences? Why is that question important, and can we not allow ourselves not to raise it? My answer will take the form of a thesis. The difficulty with multicultural differences has not first of all to do with the difference of the other, but with one's own difference, my own difference. In order to clarify what I mean, I should first have to investigate the structure of our own difference and then gradually confront it with the difference of the other. But I've been talking now for 43 minutes. Can you still, I can't stop without feeling offended. Okay, I go on. Okay, the fourth section, the structure of difference. Let me start by way of an example. I am in love, madly in love, and so is she. After a romantic dinner, we walk on a moonlit beach with the soft roar of the waves in the distance and the stars above. She asks, "Do you love me?" And I reply in a husky voice, and bend over to kiss her. But she wants to know why I love her. And I answer with a long enumeration. Because you are blonde and interested in Byzantine culture, and always laugh and are so cheerful, and have such long sexy legs, and cup C, and cook so well. Before I come to the end of my song of praise, she smacks me in the face. The affair is over. And I, for my part, enrolled for philosophy. I followed Drew's lecture course on Levinas and understand what has happened. All the characteristics that I had named could just as well have fitted another woman. She felt that I not loved her for who she was, but for what she was. And if I loved her for these characteristics, how would I then relate to a woman who had all these characteristics plus one? That can be. So okay, I've learned my lesson. And after some time, I fall in love again at openness. But now I feel prepared. And when we walk on a beach again, and I sense the same fatal question approaching, I know what to answer. Yes, I love you. And I do not care that you have this sexy body and like Wagner. It could just as well have been Beethoven or Coldplay. And I don't care that you have these sexy legs, but it could just as well have been O legs and curved teeth and reddish hair. Everything you are, could have been different. And I would still love you again as friend. And it's so. Why? What did I do wrong this time? Now this example is evidently not merely chosen to explain why so many young and less young persons are nowadays studying philosophy in Leuven. It also shows what is missing in Levinas's definition of the other as someone whose alterity precedes the characteristics that make him other. Or whose alterity is not the result of the characteristics that make him other. For my second lover, also felt mistreated, perhaps a bit less than the first, but still. The reason is that people not only have characteristics they or anyone else can understand the meaning of, but that they also care about certain things, be they inner or outer, and that they want to be appreciated for these things, and more still, that they want these things to be appreciated. The structure of caring about things cannot be fully explained by the qualities and meanings of such things. The latter don't have to be spectacular. It suffices that one is touched by them, cares for them, even though one does not know why. Which is to say, what someone cares about is special, not because it has a special meaning, but because it's meaningful for that person. Meaningfulness is contrary to what the word suggests, not the same as fullness of meaning. And this is an example of how philosophy hides in language. I copy that from that philosophy. It's not, meaningfulness is not fuller with meaning than something else. What is meaningful does not have meaning. It's significant, but that's not the same as having meaning. The difference between the two, between having meaning and being meaningful, is less difficult than it may seem. For meaning, a certain distance is required. Something must be able to show itself as it is, for us to grasp the meaning of it. What we call meaningful, however, has made such an impression on us that this distance is absent. It has literally impressed itself on us. It was, so to speak, already in us before we could take notice of it. With the corollary that we cannot, without further ado, free ourselves from it, so that we could a posteriori grasp its meaning. As I suggested, the meaningful is more often than not something very banal, that has nothing impressive or spectacular about it. And that has nonetheless struck you. In your thus being touched or struck, you are vulnerable, exactly because you can't give a reason for being thus struck by it. Whereas the reasons belong to the order of meaning, of what one can understand. The meaningful falls outside of that order. We don't have a grip on it. It is something that has us, not something we have, or to the meaning of which we have access. Yeah. Now, the other does not appear in his or her own mind. She does not coincide with himself, with herself, but hangs on things that have attached themselves to her, have made an impression on her, and partly determined who she is, even if she does not have knowledge of these things,
does not consciously care for them, but only feels their weight in certain circumstances. For example, it's morning, you rise, and before going out, you have a look in the mirror. What you see is how you appear. You can judge your appearance in that mirror and grasp its meaning. I don't know. You got out and someone compliments you about your look. You feel flattered. But why? You already knew you looked well. The compliment, however, was not about that which you had already seen yourself in the mirror. It did not touch on what you know. Wasn't meant as a confirmation of that knowledge. One does not generally answer to, you look well today, every day. Thank you, I know. That's better. The compliment was not about the looks that you already had seen. It aimed at an appearance that did not appear to you. It aimed at that of you which you could not see, because it situates itself in a dimension that falls outside of the order of things. For each of us, there are many such things for which we depend on the appreciation of others. Such an appreciation differs from a judgment that would determine the meaning of something, the meaning of which eluded us, and that we would now come to grasp by our own. The appreciation has to do with the eluding and with what eludes. It recognizes our vulnerability by, as it were, accommodating for it. It provides that vulnerable part of ourselves with a kind of shelter, puts it up, provides it with words that take it over for us. But things aren't always that simple. The compliment is a form of social contact, but we do not have such forms forever. There are also things about us that isolate us and that we do not lose that easily. Values, for example, of social, cultural, or multicultural characteristics, of which we are even not conscious, we are often not conscious, but into which we bump at times. We don't succeed to distance ourselves from these things. Moreover, we feel we cannot do so, or it would come down to a self-betrayal. One might ask us what got into us, and we try to explain. The other party understands what we are saying, but is not likewise touched by it. He or she has other values. We argue further and further, but with no result. In the to and fro of our argument, the conversation always gets stuck in words that owe their weight to the value horizon from which we speak, and that do not have that weight for the other part. For example, suppose that my daughter comes home and says, "Hey Dad, how are you? Oh, by the way, I'm getting an abortion tomorrow." Oh, you don't need to come with me and say, "Wait a moment, suppose that I'm very Catholic person." I say, "But my dear, you don't get an abortion in the way that you get a new goat." And we sit down and we are willing to discuss. After a while, we turn in circles. I say life is holy. She says, "What life? Life of microbes too? And what about my life?" etc., etc. You know these arguments. Now good. But it will always get stuck in words like life is holy, that owe their weight to the value horizon from which we speak and that do not have that weight for the other part. That weight is strange, not just for the other, however, but also for us. Apparently our own values are not that much our own as we thought. There is something to them that eludes us and that we seem unable to express in the order of meaning. This something that eludes us is an undeterminable point where our values impress themselves on us. What blocks our conversation is not the other's unwill to understand me, but the structure of what is proper to me, what is my own. It too is to a certain extent foreign to me. What is my own, what is proper to me, is something that is of significance for who I am, but the meaning of which eludes me. Inasmuch as the other grasps that meaning, he understands what I say, he grasps the wrong thing, or he misses the way these words have for me. Even when he understands that they have an importance for me that can't be understood, this does not suffice to annul his otherness. And in the situation I sketch, the same holds for my understanding of his words. For the other too does not come of my peace. He too has something about him that he does not possess. That something is different. Not the difference between us, but first and foremost to each of us. We both have something proper to us that the other has not, and both of us serve, so to speak, around a whole series of such somethings that keep us in our field, in their field of gravitation, and now and again announce themselves in an ungraspable manner. When this happens, one trips or stumbles over one's own difference. The difference surprises us as the unfamiliar line of our familiarity with ourselves. That familiarity breaks and is, as it were, perforated by the fact that the other's otherness unintentionally confronts us with its reverse. In other words, we are defamiliarized with ourselves. Dispossessed, we are dispossessed of what we thought to have as our own. To have is to be able to grasp meaning, to be able to give arguments for it. We cannot experience our own otherness in the strict sense of the term. It is simply too close to us. You will remember what I said before about the meaningful not being of the order of meaning. You will remember this when I now mention this too close. Hence one can understand, though understand doesn't mean approve, the tendency to nonetheless lay hands on what eludes us, by looking for a cause for that illusion and finding that cause in the other. For example, the following is, my ownness would not be a problem had not the other affected. He or she is ultimately responsible for the fact that I don't fall together with my stuff. That split in me, my own otherness, only came into being by his intervention. And if he disappears or adapts, that becomes one of us, and loses his otherness, that split will disappear too, and then it shall be one. In that reaction, an intersubjective problem, an intrasubjective problem, so the problem within the subject, is shifted outside the subject and explained, or better still experienced, as an intersubjective problem. The problem within the subject is now explained as something between the subject and another subject. Multiculturalism can thus be seen as a plurality outside of us that does not really have anything to do with us, but only with the other. We should be able to block such a reflex reaction. But the difficulty is that to achieve such an aim, a simple appeal like discover the unfamiliar strangeness of yourself